So anyway, it's now gone 2 o'clock and it's time for us to begin today's webinar proper. And so first of all, this, as you know, most of these webinars are now being sponsored by particular people. This week, I want to thank Penn and Kathy Hackney for their generous sponsorship of this particular webinar. And always remember, you too can sponsor a webinar if you wish to. I'll tell you more about that later. I'll be telling you more about the upcoming webinars as well. But for the moment, you may remember our guest host today, Kathleen Dixon Donnelly, presented a piece about, what, 6 weeks ago on the Algonquin Circle and sorry, I'm turning down the volume of the music, on the Algonquin Circle and Dorothy Parker. And this week, because she is an absolute authority, believe me, she's going to be talking about the Irish literary revival and the foundation of the Abbey Theatre. Let me hand you over now to Catherine. Bless you.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? I didn't get a response.
Yes,
you can.
We can hear you.
And you can see me.
Yeah.
The system works. Hooray. Let's go to Dublin. Hi, I'm thrilled to be back. I enjoyed doing the Algonquin Roundtable, and today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, the Irish. I married one. As I explained last time, the research that I did was about 4 groups of writers who hung out together. I want to make sure. And there was the Irish group, Yates and his friends, who we'll talk about today, and Virginia Woolf and the Bloomsbury group, and Gertrude Stein from Pittsburgh and the Americans in Paris, and of course Dorothy Parker and the Algonquin Roundtable, who we talked about last time. So today we're just going to talk about Yates and primarily about the work that they did to put together the wonderful Abbey Theatre, which is still there, and they're doing a lot of really creative things online since they can't be open. I will just point out, for some of you I know are members of the lifelong learning programs at Pitt and CMU, and at Pitt, starting next week, I'll be doing a class about writers' salons before the Great War. So that includes Ireland and Virginia Woolf, if you're interested. And there'll be some overlap with today, but there'll be a lot more kind of about the hanging out part, more than the theater part. The title, Such Friends, do you have my slide up, Catherine? Ah, there we go. Oh, I can see it. How nice. If you go to the next one. There we go. The title comes from W.B. Yeats' poem, where he walks around an art gallery and sees all the people who he founded the Abbey with, and ends by saying, "And say my glory was I had such friends." So today we're actually going to talk about the friends who he had, the exact same ones. If those of you who were with us last time, you may remember that in every group that I looked at, there were different roles. Different people played different roles. And every group had a star. And guess who the star was? Catherine? Slide? Whoop, come on, we want to see his picture. There he is, Willie Yates. Born in 1865 in Dublin. Primarily known as a poet, but he was also a playwright. His father was a real interesting character, John Butler Yates, and his father was a lawyer and was doing quite well. And then one day he woke up and said, "I think I want to be a painter." Mrs. Yates was not thrilled about this, but he just went ahead with it and went to art school in London and took the family with him, and then they came back to Dublin, and then they went to London. So they were people in that time, considering no credit cards, no planes, they went back and forth a lot. And so the family was kind of, between two. Now, years later, Yates was friends with Oscar Wilde, as was everyone in Ireland and London. And Oscar used to tell the story about this, how this guy was a successful lawyer and he just chucked it all to be a painter. And people would say, "Oh, but was he a good painter?" And Oscar Wilde would say, "No, that's the beauty of it. He was a poxy painter." In reality, it wasn't that bad, but it made a good story for Oscar. around about 1894, Yates was in London, and actually for a long time he lived in, and you can visit them, they're lovely, what's called the Woburn buildings. They're right down from Euston Station. It's a lovely little street in London with little cafes and things, in the Bloomsbury neighborhood. And I believe he was there kind of overlapping Virginia Woolf and her sister down the street in Gordon Square. But he had his first play produced in 1894. It was called The Land of Heart's Desire. It was not good. And it was on a double bill with Shaw, Arms and the Man. And Shaw was actually just kind of starting out at the time. And that particular set of plays was produced by a very wealthy English woman named Anne Horniman. And remember her because she'll be back. So we have our star who's kind of in the center of this group of people, but every star needs to have a hostess. And Willie had, slide, Lady Gregory. There she is, just lovely. Lady Gregory was the ultimate hostess. She was great. And it's actually between the two of them, mostly all the other people in the group, that we have the Abbey Theatre. Lady Gregory was born Isabella Augusta Pearce in one of the big old West of Ireland homes called Roxborough. Big family. She was like the 14th child of her father. And the others were these brothers who were just a pain in the neck, and landowners. Now, the thing to remember about all these people, except one, is that they were Protestant. We think of Ireland as riven with Catholics, but the Protestants were part of what was called the Anglo-Irish Ascendancy, and they were in charge. They were the landed class and the ruling class, basically. They weren't English or British or Scottish, they were Irish. And this was, her family was part of that as well. She was pretty much ignored by her family. One story is that when she was born, the mother was having a difficult birth, so they took Augusta and just stuck her on a shelf somewhere and paid attention to the mother. So the brothers just kind of wrote her off and figured, well, you know, she'll make dinner for us. But at a family event in the 1870s, late 70s or whatever, she met one of the neighbors, Sir William Gregory, member of Parliament, governor of Ceylon, knighted, quite the man, and quite older than she was. And he was fascinated by her. She was intelligent, she was smart, she'd never gone to school. Girls didn't go to school. She'd read as much as she could. He changed his will to leave her books, his books, and was so fascinated by her that he married her. And her brothers couldn't believe it. Why would anyone be interested in her? So in 1880, they got married. They had a really good marriage. They had one son, Robert, and she got a fabulous life out of this. I mean, he might have been an old coot, but boy, they went. They had a place in London where she had a salon. So that was her first salon. And at that salon, she would have people sign her fan. She had one of those lovely fans that women had in those days, and they would sign it. She met Queen Victoria. They traveled to Egypt. They traveled to the Middle East. She was involved with culture and politicians and had fascinating people, including Oscar Wilde, over to dinner at the salon. And so it was a really good life. She was also trying some writing. She got a few things published, a few articles and things. And so she was kind of finding her way. But then in 1892, she would have been 40, William died. It was a shame. We miss him. Quite the gambler, though, but decent guy. And here she was, 40. You know, at the time, it was considered that that was it. That was her life. It's over. You can see from the picture, she always wore widow's weeds, black dresses. She was quite short, our Augusta. There she is. And but she was looking for a project. Now, the first thing she did was, he had started on his autobiography. So she contacted a publisher and said she would finish it. And so she worked on that, and that was kind of well received. And she was very, unlike some of the landed gentry, she was interested in the local peasants, basically, but the local culture. She had had a nurse when she was growing up who spoke Irish, and she picked up some of it. Lady Gregory learned some Irish, and she would go around and listen to the folk tales and write them down. She would be kind of collecting folk tales from the locals. Okay, but at this point in the late 90s, she had some things to do. You know, the kid, he goes off to boarding school, so she was kind of bored, but she knew she had a life ahead of her, and what a life it was. So we have our hostess, and then every group, think of your own group of friends. There's always an irritant. Don't look around, okay? George Moore was really irritating. He was really a pain in the neck. You can see he was born the same year as Lady Gregory, just about a month before. So he's actually the oldest of all the ones in all my groups. Nobody remembers him now, thank God, because he was really a pain. But at the time, he came from one of the big families and houses in the west of Ireland also. That house is called Moore Hall. And I think, you might want to Google this, I think I saw that the local government, wherever county that is, has bought it, and they're fixing it up, and they're going to open it to the public as one of the historic sites to see. So hold off on your trip to Ireland until you can go see that. He traveled, it's a wealthy family. He traveled around a lot, London, Paris, whatever. And in 1887, he wrote a book called Confessions of a Young Man. Anyone remember that? No. But at the time, it was a huge hit. And mainly it was because he was talking about all these great experiences he had and alluding to his experiences with women. And so a lot of times in the literature of the time, you'll see references where someone was greatly influenced by George Moore and Confessions of a Young Man. So that was him. He gave us something. And he did, we'll see, he did help a lot with the Abbey Theater. So we'll give him credit for that. But the only other thing that he left us, God bless him, is a few years after that, actually 94, he published a book of short stories, because he wrote nonfiction, he wrote fiction, he wrote anything he wanted to. He published a book called Celibates, and it was short stories. And in there is a short story. Now, I confess I haven't read it, but I did see the film, and maybe some of you did too. Here, anybody see my, you want to show this? The short story was called The Strange Life of Albert Nobbs, and it was turned into a play. And Glenda Jackson saw the play. Actually, I think the play was in French, and she just fell in love with it. Yeah, no, yes, no, Glenn Close. I get the two confused. There she is. Okay, and that way. She took the play and she did it off Broadway, and then she turned it into this film, Albert Nobbs, which some of you might have seen, and it's quite good. Now, the film itself has nothing to do with the Irish that we're going to talk about today, but I use it sometimes in class because it really shows Dublin 1890s. It's quite well done. And I will also tell you that the other star of the movie is Janet Mcteer, who you might have enjoyed in Ozark. This is quite a different role for her. So that's my video tip for today. I think I put it on the reading list, which you can get online as well. So that's George Moore. Okay, he had his role being irritating. To balance off the irritant, you always have to have a sweet person. We have an angel, and his name was George Russell. But early on, he adopted the pen name A.E. Why? Who knows? And he was very spiritual, and he was a writer, a poet, and he also did a lot of drawings. If you check out his drawings online, it's hard to believe he didn't have LSD at the time. You can see 2 years younger than Yates, and he and Yates actually met in high school. They went to the same high school, art school, together. And Yates said everyone was in awe of A.E. Then he was probably George, but he was always spouting these spiritual things. And as they got to be friends, they both got involved in theosophy, and Madame Blavatsky, she's quite the character, and also the Order of the Golden Dawn. I mean, they had all these, I lost track, all these strange occult groups where they would have seances and things. And this was both in London and Dublin, because they were going back and forth quite a bit. A.E., and there's kind of a cult of A.E. over there in Ireland. There's a society for him that they send me emails every once in a while. He is, in all the groups, he's one of the few of the writers and artists who actually had a day job. He worked for many years as a clerk in a drapery store called Pym's right in Dublin. And so he kind of had to work for a living. The rest of them had some sort of family money kind of keeping them going until they had actual careers as writers and artists. So we have the irritant, we have the angel. And then we also need to have a sponsor. There he is, Edward Martin. And if you remember back in the Algonquin Roundtable group, it was Harold Ross who got the money to start the New York. Edward Martin didn't have to get money from anybody. He had more money than God. And one description of him in one of the biographies was he was that very rare thing in Ireland, a rich Catholic. So he was the only Catholic. He came from a long line of really rich people, and he was the only child and never had any kids, believe me. And with my slides, with these, I like to show people more than anything, but I thought you'd like to see his house. Next slide. There we go, to Lyra. It's still there. No, it's not open to the public. It's in private hands. Now, I think it was up for sale just a year or two ago, and there was a video on YouTube showing the inside of it. If you can find that, trust me, look at it. It's amazing. My husband and I, we drove up there. You can drive through the gate, and drove up in front of the house and got out of the car and ran around taking pictures. And I think who was ever in it was just looking out the window saying, more Americans. The story is that quite a few years ago, before this most recent sale, an American came across it and just fell in love with it and made a deal with the Irish owner that he would trade for his yacht. This is why they like Americans so much. So it's still there. You can't go inside, but it's worth driving by. And Edward would spend a lot of his time in the turret, which you can see there. Edward was a very strange person, but he was very generous with his money. And so he put up a lot of the money to keep the Abbey Theatre going, particularly in the beginning. And he also funded Sinn Féin, a political party, and also choir boys. We don't want to know any more about that. Anyway, he was and also a playwright. He started out, he was like an amateur, trying to write some plays, and heavily influenced by Ibsen, who was, a big deal at the time. And that was considered very avant-garde to be writing plays like Ibsen. So we have our sponsor, and then there was always someone in the group who kind of sat back a bit, the observer, part of the group, but always sort of looking. When you read descriptions of the time about the Abbey, it'll say that Yates was expounding something and Lady Gregory was kind of taking care of everybody, and there was Singh sitting back in the corner. But a fascinating man. You can see he was younger, really, than the others. And he actually became good friends with Yates's younger brother, Jack Yates, the painter. And Singh came from another landed family. I was very interested in languages. The name comes from the French. They were French troubadours way back, whatever. And he studied in Paris and studied languages at the Sorbonne. And he was doing a lot of translating and book reviews and things like that. And he was in Paris in 1898, and he met Yates, Willie Yates. Now, it isn't hard for these people to move up. I mean, there were Irish in Paris, and they all kind of knew each other. The same in London, whatever. So when they started talking, Yates said to him, "Go find your roots, go to the Aran Islands." And Singh said, "That's a good idea." So he had his first trip over there in 1898. And actually, Lady Gregory was there. She had gone over to listen to the dialect, and it's a lovely trip. If you do it as a day trip out of Galway, you can still go. It's a bit more developed than it was when they were there. But Singh went to the Aran Islands, got to know a lot of the people there, and picked up the dialect. And his book, The Aran Islands, which is essays about his trip, is really lovely. And then later on, the part that we'll get to was when he was writing plays. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about him, but I heartily recommend that you sign up for the next 2 weeks to talk about his two best plays, Riders to the Sea and Playboy of the Western World. And just as a tip, those are kind of the two best plays out of this whole thing. Like, these were lovely people, but the plays were, they're cute. They're short. That's one good thing about them. They're almost all one acts. Okay? Now, every group also had to have somebody who was in touch with the establishment, the link. And here's Lady Gregory again. In all my groups, she's the only one who plays two roles. But because of her marriage to Gregory, she knew everybody. So she could get, we'll see when we talk about theater, that she could get laws changed. She knew the people in Dublin Castle, which was the seat of British government. She knew all the important people in town. So she served very well as both the link and the hostess, taking care of everyone in the group. And one last role in the group was the bridge. And this is someone who's part of the group, but is from another field. So, for example, in the Bloomsbury group, John Maynard Keynes was an economist. He was hanging out with writers and painters. Douglas Hyde, who also came from the west of Ireland, his father was a vicar, so came from a religious family, but he was very involved in politics, and particularly the politics of language, which was a big thing in Ireland at the time, of course. So he knew Irish. He had published a lot of books where the Irish was on one side of the page and the English translation was on the other side of the page. age. And he founded the Gaelic League, which I believe is probably still around today. So he was very involved with the politics of the time, but met Yates when they were both students in Dublin. And they got to be friends. They kind of knew each other. And then when the group got together and started hanging out, that's when they got to know each other even more. Now, some of you are saying, isn't there somebody missing? I was hoping we were going to hear about Maud Gonne. Maud Gonne was Ireland's La Pasionara, the rebel fighting for the freedom of Ireland. She was English, but she was the inspiration for Yates. And so she was definitely part of his life, but she wasn't really part of this group. This group was more about writing and putting on plays. She was involved with theater, we'll see that in a bit, but she was much more political. And one of the versions of how they met was one of their friends from these Irish political groups said to her, oh, you should meet this guy, Willie Yates. You know, you really like each other. Huh. And she showed up at his door in Dublin. And this is one of those stories that probably isn't true, but it's a great story, that there was a storm just like this one outside. And he opened the door and there she was, 6 foot tall. And there was a crack of lightning and the troubling of his life began. Because he was so in love with her and he kept proposing and she kept saying, no, 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 no. But the fact that she said no means that we got a lot of great literature out of this, including early on, he offered to write a play for her. And so he wrote a play called Countess Kathleen, which she performed in. Actually, it was the first play I saw at the Abbey in their Peacock Theater, which is their small theater that they have downstairs. I highly recommend it. It's a lovely play. After they had been together a couple of years, they met in '89, and after they'd been together a couple of years, she kind of mentioned that she had an adopted child who had died. And he was kind of distressed because he didn't know there were any children in the picture. And a bit later, she mentioned, well, there was another one who hadn't died. And there was this Frenchman outside of Paris. So she just had all kinds of ways of keeping Willie an arm's length away or more, but did inspire him and did get involved with this group. But she was always trying to pull him more into politics, and Lady Gregory was trying to pull him more into writing. So they were both fighting over Willie. Yep. Now, here we are, 1897. One of the reasons this year is important is it was Queen Victoria's Jubilee. In England, it was Queen Victoria's Jubilee. In Dublin, it was the Jubilee Riots, okay, because they were trying to get rid of Queen Victoria. Home rule was still a big issue. Remember, these people were all British subjects, okay, because Ireland was not free yet, and they were part of the kingdom, okay. The Jubilee Riots happened in Dublin, and right in the center of Dublin, and Yates and Maud Gonne were at, sometimes they say a pub, but I don't think they really went to pubs, but they were right off of Rutland Square, which is now Parnell Square. And she said, I'm going to go out there and address the people, my people. She was English. He said, what are you going to, wait a minute, you can't go out. What are you going to do when you get there? And she said, well, I won't know until I get there. And she ran out into the crowd and got up on some platform and gave a speech, a real rabble-rousing speech. People knew who she was, but this was really one of her better speeches where she said, you know, why are we giving up this so this queen can have a jubilee, blah. And so this kind of catapulted her into Irish politics. So after this, which was about June of 1897, Yates was exhausted. You know, I mean, she was lovely. She was exhausted. And he decided he needed a rest. So he and a friend went traveling throughout Ireland. They went to Sligo, they went around. And when they got down to the west of Ireland, his friend said, oh, come on, meet my buddy Edward Martin. And they were at a house out in the west. And who should stop by but Lady Gregory? And so at this point, we have what I always count as the start of the group, which is the star and the hostess and somebody else. So you had Yates, Lady Gregory, and Edward Martin, and they were chatting. Now, Yates and Lady Gregory would have met before. He might have even come to one of her London salons. You know, there weren't that many people around. But this is the first time they really got to know each other. And they started talking about theater. And Edward Martin had written these plays. And she said, isn't it a shame there isn't a theater that would want to, it's hard to get something produced in London, particularly if you're Irish. So, you know, maybe we could start a theater. Well, where are we going to get the money? Oh, I have a lot of friends, said Lady Gregory. Come to my house. So this is when they went to Cool, which you see the picture of there. That is the only picture I have ever seen of Cool Park. And it's not there anymore. Next slide. That's what it looks like today. Thank you, Irish government. They ripped it all down. But in its time, it was gorgeous. Apparently, the inside was just lovely. And so they went off to Cool. They started to write a prospectus to raise money for this theater. And the way they would do it is Yates would walk around the room declaiming, and Lady Gregory would sit there with the typewriter. Of course, they made her the secretary, you know, but she sat there with the typewriter, which a friend had given her and had kind of inspired her to write. And just as a tip, and I think I forgot to put this on the reading list, in Dublin, there's the Dublin Writers Museum, which is great. And they have Lady Gregory's typewriter in there, along with a lot of other lovely things. So they were sending out letters, and Martin said, well, you know, I got more money. I'll kick in some. And he actually guaranteed the cost for the first 3 years of the theater. And so they were doing things to raise money, and they were writing plays. And Yates ended up staying the whole summer at Cool, which he did many summers. And she would lock him in the 3rd floor bedroom and bring up soup. Well, she'd have the servants bring up soup and put it outside the door so no one would bother him, keep him working. He would then take a break and walk down and see the swans at Cool. And Martin too, well, Martin had his own house, which you could walk between the two, so it wasn't far. But they would collaborate. They would stay up late at night talking, doing. Yates used to tell jokes about all the people we knew in England who were these, you know, uppity British people. And so this is how they started getting the stuff together for the theater. Hyde had come by to Lyra. And what Hyde would do is he would pretend that his bike was broken, so that the locals would stop and help him. And then he'd start talking to the locals. And he was very good. He taught the others how to do this. He'd start up a conversation with somebody, one of the peasants, you know, and they'd be inside, and Hyde would give him some whiskey and maybe smoke or two. And the guy would start telling these great stories, you know, because the Irish have fabulous stories. And then when the guy was done telling the story, then Douglas Hyde would say, could you do that again? And could I write it down? And then he'd take out a pen and paper. He didn't want to do that in the beginning. It would kind of intimidate them. But then he would say, oh, you want to write that down? Sure. And he'd tell the story again. And this is how Hyde would draw out stories from the people. Lady Gregory got to do this too. She'd go around with Yates, but she'd keep Yates outside the house. She'd go in and talk to them. What Hyde would do, what they would do when they got together at Cool Park is one of them would write a play in English, and then they would give it to Hyde, and he would translate it into the Irish and then translate it back. And they called it putting the Irish on it. And that's how the dialect would get the lilt, the famous, lovely Irish lilt, into the dialect of the plays. So they would work very closely together. They wanted to put on this theater. They wanted to start a theater company. They knew they didn't have much theater experience, none really, except Yates had some plays produced. So they figured they better get George Moore. Remember him? He had a lot of theater experience. He had done some production and writing of plays in London. So they didn't like him, but they figured, let's get him. So they brought him in. And by 1899, oh, and there's one more picture of Cool Park, which is the next one. Next one. Yeah, this is my picture of the autograph tree. When people would come to Cool Park, Lady Gregory would have them carve their initials in the tree. And if you look down at the bottom there, you see a little white splotch kind of, there is a diagram on the tree that shows you whose signatures are whose. And I did put on the reading list, there's a video of Cool Park. It's open to the public. It's a national park. It's lovely. I don't know if it's open right now, but it's outside, so maybe. And on the video, they do close-ups of the tree where you can see the signature. So it's really lovely. I highly recommend Cool Park as a tourist destination. Okay, but at this point, they finally did rent. We're not going to go to them yet. We're coming back. Let's stay with the autograph tree for now. 1899, they rented some rooms called the Ancient Concert Rooms to put on plays. Now, Lady Gregory was the one who got the law changed so that you could do plays in that venue, because there are all kinds of restrictions. You know, the British, they don't want to have fun. So her connections really helped there. And they put on Countess Kathleen. And it got some good reviews. The whole time they were, you know, throughout the Abbey, if there were any reviews that weren't glowing, Lady Gregory would invite the reporters or the writers from that paper, to her hotel room. In Dublin, she stayed at the Nassau Hotel on Nassau Street, right up from the main part of Dublin. She'd invite them over for tea and say, now, what didn't you like about that play? She was always grilling them. I think this is a great public relations strategy, to tell you the truth. So they would spend the summers at Cool writing these plays, and then they would put them on. They were the Irish National Theatre Society, the Irish Literary Society. They went by a whole bunch of names, and there were different people coming in and out, but once they got more in, that was the group that we talked about, those original people. At one point, Lady Gregory wrote to Yates, I think this is a lovely quote. Think about this when you're sitting at home. I don't like losing any of your visit. The summer slips away so quickly, and oh, you have so much more work to do. Thanks, Augusta. Here I thought I was going to have a rest, She really kept them going, and they did. They were quite prolific altogether. They really, produced quite a lot of these plays. Now, like I said, most of them were one acts, didn't involve a whole lot of staging, wanted to keep costs down and everything. And in 1902, now you can go to that next slide. In 1902, they put on the premiere of this play that is often, and for a long time, was attributed to Yates, but it turns out Lady Gregory did just as much work on it, Kathleen New Houlihan, and that is Maud Gonne playing Kathleen New Houlihan. It's quite political. I just attended a reading of it. An Irish theater group in South Florida does these online readings, and I'd never really read through the whole play before. It's not, it's very political. And later on, it was criticized that it inspired a lot of young Irish men to go out and give their lives for Ireland. But in 1902, they put it on with her. Her reviews were kind of mixed because they said, well, she's kind of playing herself, it's not much of a stretch there, Maud. But this at least kept the theater going. Now, the other thing that happened in that summer, I'm going to inject this because this guy is one of my favorite characters. You want to go to the next slide? His name is John Quinn. Now, John Quinn is an Irish-American, he's American, but Irish-American lawyer, art collector, rich guy. And around about 1902, he had quite a few deaths in his family, and he decided he would go trace his Irish roots. And he went over to Ireland as a tourist in 1902 and went traveling around, just like I did. And he went to a festival in the west of Ireland. And who should he meet? Yates, Lady Gregory, Douglas Hyde, as you do. And he became really good friends with them. And the thing I like about John Quinn, we could do a whole thing on him, he was a big supporter of the arts. So besides just being an art collector, he helped the theater with their legal work. Of course, he donated money, which is always a nice thing. But beyond that, he arranged lecture tours for Yates to come to America, also for Hyde to come to America and hit on rich Americans for money. These people did this a lot, okay? And he would buy up manuscripts of writers. He bought up a lot of Yates's manuscripts to support Yates's father. It's another great story. So John Quinn came into the theater kind of as an outsider, but he made quite a few trips. He tried to get over every summer to Paris and London, but also Dublin, which is where his heart was, of course. Within the theater, these were theater people, and they were Irish, so there was a lot of fighting. AE left, AE came back. Don't let Yates talk to the actors. He upsets them. Lady Gregory, bring them some fruitcake. It was just fighting back and forth, and they had a hard time kind of keeping it going, like any theater group. So Yates said, gee, I know somebody who has done things like this. And he brought in Anne Horniman. Next slide. Remember her? Yes, no, not him. Next one, there she is, Anne. Now, she was quite wealthy. I have a feeling the family made money in tea or something. I'm not real sure on that. But she also had the hots for Yates. So when he said, come help, she said, sure. And she gave them a whole lot of money. She also did other things. She wasn't just Miss Moneybags. She did some set design and some staging and things. So she was really involved in the theater. They premiered Singh's Riders to the Sea, and he got props from all the people he knew in the Aran Islands. He wrote to them and said, send me your shoes and things like that. So it was quite authentic. She put up a lot of money, and she said, you guys are moving around all these different places. You need a home. I'll buy you a building. Okay. And so she bought them this lovely building. Want to see it? Next slide. Ah, there it is. Isn't that a looker? So that's when they became the Abbey Theater, 1904 on Abbey Street. Lady Gregory and Miss Horniman, not such friends. And in fact, Lady Gregory said Miss Horniman made the building, not the theater. Get it, lady? They premiered on December 27th, 1904. Let me go to the next slide. Here's the poster. And you'll notice that Kathleen Houlihan is indicated as Yates. Since then, if you go to any of the Abbey website, they credit it to both Yates and Lady Gregory. On the opening night, December 27th, Lady Gregory couldn't be there. She was sick. She must have been really sick. And she was back at Cool Park. So at the end of the performance, Yates and Miss Horniman got up and took all the bows. Eventually, Lady Gregory did make it over in order to see that particular production of Kathleen the Houlihan. And there was actually one time, I think it was like 2009, where she played Kathleen the Houlihan because the actress got sick and Lady Gregory figured, hey, I wrote it, I can do it. She stepped in at the last minute and did quite a job, actually. So at this point, at least they had a building, you know, they were going a lot stronger. In 2006, AE finally just left, you know, and they just had one fight too many. And he took his Deirdre play with him off in a huff. And so that in 2006 is where I count as the end of the group, the social group of such friends. But after that, of course, the theater still went on. And in fact, in 1907 is when they put on Playboy of the Western World, which you will hear more about in 2 weeks. And as many people know, there were riots. And by the way, there is a good play that a friend of mine in London wrote called The Playboy Riots, all about it. It's a fascinating story. The main thing was, as my Irish husband says, it was because they told the truth. And they put Irish peasants and real people on stage acting like real people. And the Irish don't like to see themselves that way sometimes. And so there was a lot of rah. And Yates came up and addressed the crowd and said, the author of Kathleen the Houlihan addresses you. And they said, who? No, they knew who he was. But he got a lot out of it in 2007. But then the play, you know, went on and actually is still being performed a lot without riots. In 1909, Singh died. He died the youngest of any in all my groups. And it was very sad. In 1911, they did their first American tour, and Quinn helped them set that up. And they started in Boston, put on Playboy, no problem. And then they went to New York. And one of the nights in New York, and Lady Gregory was a huge hit in America. They just loved her. She gave great quote, you know. So they would interview her. She gave some talks. She met Theodore Roosevelt. He became a big fan. And in one of the performances in New York, there were all these, you know, I love my Irish American compatriots, but sometimes they get a little overzealous. Oh, we're for the old country. And they were throwing things at the actors on the stage and everything. It wasn't quite a riot, but it was a bit of a kerfuffle. And they went on from there to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, the entire cast was arrested and for putting on an obscene play. Well, John Quinn comes flying over from, not flying, but on the train, from New York to Philadelphia, and he bails them out, and he took on the case. And this was another thing he did as a lawyer. He did a lot of legal work for a lot of writers and artists, pro bono, obviously. And so they went on with their tour. Now, one interesting fact that I found, and it is in the Abbey Archive, and if you're doing any kind of research, the Abbey has this detailed archive, every performance from December 27th, 1904 till now. And what I found that matched up with other research that I had was that when they were performing in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Music Hall, it was a benefit performance that the college club sponsored for them to benefit a hospital. Lady Gregory was able to announce from the stage that the charges were dropped, thanks to her friend, John Quinn. And they went on to, they did a lot of touring, and how they got around. I mean, Indiana, Notre Dame, they were a big hit in Chicago. Chicago kept bringing them back. They did perform again in Pittsburgh in 1913 at the Nixon Theater. If any of you remember the old Nixon Theater. And so at this point, they're going pretty good. 1910, the king died, King Edward. Well, the Irish didn't care. All of the theaters in London went black because the king had died. Long live the new king. It's George, I think. Well, the Abbey said, nah, we don't care. Let him die. There's supposed to be another one. And that kind of pissed off Miss Horniman, and she wasn't that happy anyway. And she, by this point, kind of figured she wasn't going to get a piece of Willie. So she said, no, I'm out. So she left, even though she guaranteed salaries and things for them. So they kind of had to go back to Lady Gregory's friends and do a lot of touring, which I'm sure paid well. They also rented out the theater itself. When you see in the archive, there's all these other organizations that sometimes rent it, sometimes Yates will give a talk. And so at this point, they were actually doing quite well. And so what I would like to do now is to just take a bit of a break to have Alan maybe pass on to me any of the questions. I'm going to put my headphone in so I can hear you and me. And if there's any questions before we finish off. I can't see you, Alan.
I was just rejoining you both.
There you are.
I turned off my mic and my camera so we would focus on you, but now I'm back. Can everybody hear me okay? Just picking up on some of the things you were saying. The Miss Horniman. Let's working backwards, because Miss Horniman was one of the last things correct. She was of Horniman Teas. That's where she made her money. That's where the money came from, and she was what we would nowadays call a sort of theatrical dilettante. She sort of bought into. Are you hearing me, Kathleen?
No, it's very much of an echo. I can't hear.
Okay, let me take that down again. Can you hear me now? Hello.
That's a little better, yeah.
Okay, right.
Are you talking?
No. She was.
Listen, can you put the question under questions? I can see that.
Well, no, because what I'm at the moment, I'm just doing discussion. You can see some of the. Anyway, look, I'll move. I'll ask you brief questions as clearly as I can as we go there. But before I do, I want to say a couple of things. You've summarized quite brilliantly all of that wonderful group of very, very different people who managed to seem to come together at a point. One of the things that you did touch on, and without going into it too deeply, the relationship between art, poetry, and politics at the time in Ireland was incredibly close. In fact, when the revolution came, when the eruption of the rising in 1916, most of the leaders were poets. Padraig Pearse and the group that surrounded him were poets. Joseph Mary Plunkett's partner, Grace Gifford, she was an illustrator. She was an artist. It's extraordinary how much that this sudden arousal of art in Ireland at that period was both political as well as artistic. And one of the quotes that's not often known of Oscar Wilde, he was talking about Irish nationalism, because his mother was very much an Irish nationalist. And he said, Ireland will never be truly a nation until it has a national theatre. Now, by that, he didn't mean a national theatre as an institution, but a theatre that was of Ireland, not second-hand English theatre. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what happened, thanks to this particular grouping, this revival grouping. Now, I'm going to actually throw some questions at you. Yes, there's an interesting one. Hazel asked the question, Yates seems to get all the credit for the creation of the Abbey, but who do you think was the heart and soul of that?
Oh yeah, I mean, Yates was lovely, but he could have never done it on his own. He was very good at rhetoric. He was very good at declaiming. Obviously, he was a great writer, but he was not an organizer at all. And one of the things that makes for interesting reading on the Abbey Archive, they have minutes of all of the board meetings because they were a corporation, and Yates would be there and Lady Gregory would be there, and they're minutes, so they're pretty boring. And then every once in a while there's a little gem, like one point where Mr. Yates wanted inserted in the Constitution that no changes are allowed to be made to any plays without the express consent of the author of the play. And you can just imagine there's some big fight. And this was his way of getting back. And the minutes were always dated the wrong day and stuff. He was just very bad at organizing. But he was the spirit of it and the heart of it. And obviously it couldn't have happened without him. But I think even he would have to admit it couldn't have happened without all these other people as well. Even George Moore, you know.
On that topic, it's sort of always suggested, and I always understood it from, perspective of Irish theatre, that Yates was obsessive about the words of his plays. He didn't particularly like actors interpreting. He would prefer them to intone the plays in a monotone, so the beauty of his own language would come through. I don't think he was a lover of actors in particular. There's another good question here. Most of the players like the founders and the writers of the upper classes, were there any working class writers in the mix? Now I know an answer to that, which you probably come up with, which was later on with the arrival of O'Casey. But were there at the time, were there any non-aristocratic writers within that mix?
Okay, it's still really hard to hear you, but I think you were asking about the actors in the theater.
And the writers.
And when they first started, actually, when they first got together, and the writers, well, when they first got together planning the theater, I found this lovely. It was in one of the books that they decided they wouldn't use any Irish actors because there really weren't any. You know, they would just use English actors, and they had all their rehearsals over in London too. And I can just imagine that there were these Irish actors going, "We're here. What's wrong? How come you're bringing in these English people to do Irish accents?" Eventually, after the first few years, then they did build up quite a repertoire of these Irish actors, and some of the ones. Kathleen Nesbitt, who I always thought was lovely. But there was one young woman, and she actually might come up in the Singh lectures because her sister was engaged to Singh. Her name was Sarah Allgood. And when I was going through this archive, man, she was the workhorse. She would do Kathleen Houlihan and Riders to the Sea on the same bill, you know, and every day. And they'd go on tour, America, England, Ireland, Scotland, all over. These people really worked hard, you know, and I'm sure they weren't paid that much. It was a professional company. So I think they did get paid, and Lady Gregory got royalties, and boy, they did a whole lot of her plays all the time. But so the actors themselves, and then writers would submit plays via mail, and Lady Gregory and Yates would look at them and, you know, decide what was going to be performed. And that's how we get to what I was going to finish off with is Sean O'Casey.
I'll come back to that. Actually, the people that you mentioned, that the list of people in that group, Douglas Hyde is. I'm always fascinated by the fact that Douglas Hyde, who had such a contribution to make, was so much an intrinsic part of that, being a Protestant and coming from a church family. As you say, his father was a vicar. Actually, and he was the founder of the Gaelic League. It's still there, and he was in fact the very first president of the Irish Republic, which is why I say the politics and the art always seem to interlink in Ireland. It's a strange and wonderful thing. What was the name? I've got a question. What is the name of the George Moore short story that became a movie?
Didn't get that. Movie?
What, the name of the George Moore. I'm not sure why you're not hearing me, because everybody else is. It's very odd.
Oh, it's Albert Nobbs.
Albert Nobbs. That was it. Albert Nobbs. Yes.
The story was called The Secret Life of Albert Nobbs, and this is the film, so it's on DVD. It's really a lovely, lovely film, and it's a fascinating story. A few years ago, she won an Oscar, and I think the movie won a writing Oscar for her as well. But it's really, I highly recommend it. I know of no films about Yates, Lady Gregory, the theater, even Yates and Maud Gonne. They'd be a fabulous movie, but I don't think anyone's ever done it that I know of.
Well, in fact, many years ago, the Irish national broadcaster, RTE, Radio Telefísión, produced two programs, one about Yates and one about Lady Gregory. And I know that in particular because in the program about Yates, I played Edward Martin. And in the program about Lady Gregory, I played one of her brothers. So there is stuff, whether it's archived, whether it's available, but there are certainly two programs because the Lady Gregory was played by Siobhan McKenna, one of the great Irish actresses. So I know that Irish television has produced documentaries, but to my knowledge, there have been no movies.
I'll have to look for that.
Fascinating stories. They're absolutely fascinating stories. Good question here. To what extent do you think that the elites, as we're talking about them, and they were mostly Protestant elites, did they appropriate the culture of the peasantry? I mean, in a way, you sort of touched on it. Our perception of Irish peasantry is to a large extent based on the writings, the plays of Lady Gregory, the plays of John Millington Singh. It's like they almost created their own stage Irishmen.
Well, you're talking about the culture, like of the country folk in Ireland. Yeah, and not Lady Gregory knew Irish, and of course Douglas Hyde did. But Yates and the others, I don't think they really did. Their whole point from the beginning was to put on plays by Irish people about Irish people, and I was under the impression that they had done them all in English. But in reality, in the beginning, they did do some plays that they performed in Irish with Irish speakers. At the time, if you think about it, now you know more about theater at the time than I do, Alan, but it was English people in drawing rooms drinking tea. You know, that's what was being presented in Irish theater. And Dublin was really a backwater. I mean, it was, you know, London was where all the action was. So it was really kind of a big deal for them to bring culture and have it, you know, open for lots of people to come. In some of their American tours, there were productions, particularly in Chicago, that said at reduced prices. I think they did that so that, you know, more of the common people could come to the theater. And they were quite popular. Like I said, in Chicago, they kept getting invited back and putting on special performances by request. Playboy, Kathleen Houlihan, and others.
Somebody here just a question, or more of a, you know, in the sense of being a national theatre, and I know you want to come to that point in a second. What cities were part? Was Belfast, which had been the birthplace of some wonderful contemporary actors, included? Well, let me just begin by saying, at the time of the Abbey Theatre being created, Dublin, whole of Ireland. I'll repeat it. The whole of Ireland. This is for the benefit of Nancy. The whole of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This was prior to independence. So Belfast and Derry, or as the English insist, Londonderry, were all part of one single country. So with the establishment of the Abbey Theatre, there was no border. It was just Ireland. The division didn't happen until much later. So yes, that would have been part of that thing. Now I know you want. And
they did tour to.
Go on.
Belfast and other parts.
Yeah. They toured the whole country. They were in that sense a theatre of the nation, and the nation was one. Was one thing. I know you want to come to a particular point. I want to just do a little plug about the next week, the next session, and then you can come back to your final point. So
Okay.
thank you everybody for tuning in. Next, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be presenting 2 programs about the youngest member of the circle that Kathleen's been talking about, and that's John Millington Singh. He was probably, of that whole group, the best playwright of them. Yates was probably one of the world's greatest poets. He wasn't one of the world's greatest playwrights, but John Millington Singh produced some drama that really founded the basis of, to my mind, what was that tremendous upsurge in an Irish theatre as opposed to a theatre from any other part of Britain. And we're going to be discussing 2 plays in particular, which we can call the Aran Island plays. One is The Playboy of the Western World. The other is Riders to the Sea. Joining me on that from Dublin, for those of you who are Pict fans here in Pittsburgh, we have Aoife Spillane-Hinks. Aoife was here with us 3 times. She directed John Beacon's Sharon's Grave. She directed Waiting for Godot when we presented it, and she also presented that remarkable Holocaust play, Our Class. She'll be joining me. She is something of an expert on Irish folk drama. She'll be joining me, and with her will be 3 actors from Dublin who'll be doing some of the some extracts from those plays for us. So it's going to be an absolutely exciting, for me, an exciting link for 2 weeks with Dublin to talk about possibly one of the great founding writers of Irish theatre in Ireland. We've talked a lot about the historic writers who then went to England, but this is one who lived, worked, and died far too young in Dublin. So that's starting from next week with John Millington Singh. For those of you, just to let you know that after those 2 weeks are up, we have a 3-week session where we're going to be deconstructing the play King Lear over a 3-week period, taking you through the play. We'll be reading segments of the play, discussing it, and explaining it all. So that's 5 exciting weeks ahead. Please register now. And don't forget, every single donation counts. And anything you can send to us, no matter how small, really matters. Thank you for being with us. Back to Kathleen now to round up on the Abbey Theatre.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish off with the part about, because Alan had mentioned many times about it being the first national theater in the world, which is true, pretty much true. And we can go, Catherine, if you want to, you can go to the next slide, which is this guy is, oh no, there were some at the end. Oh, there we go. The next slide is a guy named Lennox Robinson. We're not going to talk about him too much, but he did become one of the directors of the theater. He wrote plays as well. And so he was important in terms of the Abbey in the 1920s and beyond. But the one after that, next guy, Sean O'Casey, who many of you might be familiar with, he was not working class. He was really more middle class. He started sending plays to the Abbey, and in the 1920s, they did 3 of his, known as the Dublin Trilogy: The Shadow of a Gunman, Juno and the Paycock. And then the third one was The Plough and the Stars, which was very political. And this was about 1924. That was the year that Yates and Lady Gregory decided, and remember, by this time, Ireland had they were the Irish Free State. I think at that time they'd been through a civil war. Of course, they started each other. And Yates and Lady Gregory said, we would like to give the theater to government as a gift. And the government said, I don't know. You guys aren't doing so well. It's kind of like a revenue drain. But anyway, they worked out that it would be, they would get a government subsidy and that the government would get a representative on their board of directors. Now, if you look at the archives from the meetings, it's very interesting because there's a meeting where it says something about that there will be a representative appointed by the government to the board. And then the meeting after that, appointed by the government, is crossed out. And it turned out that the Abbey decided they would choose the government representative. It would be someone from the government that they would get to pick who it was. And right about the time that this person came on the board, they were looking to produce the third of O'Casey's plays, The Plough and the Stars. And it is very political. It's a terrific play, though. You should go see it. It's very political. It's about the Easter Rebellion, which, think about it, was only 8 years before. This was still very raw for a lot of people who lost loved ones in the rebellion. And what O'Casey had done was he didn't make the Irish heroes that heroic. They were more like real people. in the Abbey tradition. And so this is what made some people angry. They felt that he wasn't idolizing these heroes enough. And the government member of the board kind of didn't like this. And they got Casey to change a few things. But when it came down to it, like Gregory said, if you have me choose between doing the play or getting the money from the government, I'm going to pick the play. And the play went on, and they still got the subsidy from the government, and still do now, I'm sure. So they became the first government subsidized theater in the Western world. I've always heard that put in. I don't know what things were like in China at the time, but definitely for the Western world, it was the first time the government stepped in and said, yes, we need to have a national theater and we need to support it. And they did, thank God for them, and still do. So the next slide shows the lovely building that they're in now, although I believe that they're moving. And this is right on Abbey Street. As I said, they are being very creative online since they can't have productions. But the next time you go to Dublin, it's very easy to find. I highly recommend it, or catch them on tour. They still do Playboy and Writers, but they do a lot more adventurous theater and some cutting edge avant-garde theater. And it's quite the robust cultural icon that it was meant to be. So hooray for the Abbey. Cheers. Now we should all go have whiskey. That's it. Okay. Oops.
Kathleen, thank you so much. That was terrific. We will have you back to talk about another circle at some point in the not too distant future, I hope. But
Great.
Thank you, and thank you for your praise of Ireland's National Theatre. Because I worked for the opposition down the other end of O'Connell Street most of the time, but I was privileged enough. I did appear in there at the Abbey a few times, most notably in a dress as Lady Bracknell, but that's another story. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you all for tuning in. We will see you next week when we will be starting our 2-week adventure with John Millington Singh. In the meantime, take care of yourselves. Bye.
Thank you, Penn and Kathy.